The first snow of winter coated the small, secluded town of Silver Hollow in a thick, suffocating blanket. A chill more penetrating than the frost had settled in weeks before the storm, an unnatural cold that seeped into homes and hearts. Most of the townsfolk dismissed it as an early winter snap, but whispers of something far darker rippled through the community. Ellie Dawson wasn't the superstitious type. She brushed off the warnings about the winter haunt, an old legend that circulated every year when the frost came early. Locals spoke in hushed tones about a ghostly figure, pale as snow, who roamed the woods searching for souls to claim. But Ellie, a college student home for the holidays, scoffed at their tales. She'd seen enough horror movies to recognize a contrived ghost story when she heard one. One night, restless from being cooped up with her parents, Ellie grabbed her coat and decided to take a walk. The moon was a faint sliver in the night sky, casting only the palest of glows over the snow-covered landscape. She wandered toward the forest at the edge of town, the one everyone said to avoid after dark. Her breath fogged the air as she trudged through the snow, the crunch of her boots the only sound in the oppressive silence. She wasn't scared, at least that's what she told herself. The forest was eerily still, every branch heavy with ice. Ellie stopped, suddenly aware of how far she'd wandered. Turning to head back, she noticed something odd. A series of footprints leading away from the path and deeper into the woods. The prints were fresh, too large to be human, but not quite the size of an animal's. They seemed to shimmer faintly, as though frost clung to them in unnatural patterns. Probably some weird melting effect, she muttered to herself, but unease prickled at her skin. Against her better judgment, she followed the tracks. They wound through the forest in a serpentine path, weaving between trees and over fallen logs until she came to a clearing. At the center stood an old, crumbling cabin. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and its dark windows looked like hollow eyes staring out at her. Ellie hesitated. The smart thing to do would be to turn back, but curiosity gnawed at her. She took a step forward, then another, until her hand rested on the splintered door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing an interior that smelled of mildew and rot. The cabin was empty except for a wooden chair sitting in the center of the room. On the chair sat a single object, a locket. The locket was oddly pristine, as though untouched by time or weather. Ellie's fingers trembled as she picked it up, the metal icy against her skin. She opened it and froze. Inside was a small portrait of a woman, her face serene but her eyes hollow, black as the depths of the ocean. Her lips curled in a faint smile that seemed almost mocking. Ellie's unease deepened when she realized the woman's eyes. They were looking at her. Not the kind of look one gets from a portrait, but as though the image itself was alive. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, plunging the cabin into darkness. Ellie spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. Fumbling for her phone, she turned on the flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The chair was empty now. The locket tumbled from her hand as she realized she was no longer alone. In the corner, where the shadows thickened like tar, stood a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its body cloaked in a tattered shroud that seemed to ripple as if alive. The face, or what passed for one, was white and featureless, save for two deep, empty sockets where its eyes should have been. Yet Ellie could feel its gaze boring into her, freezing her in place. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure began to move toward her, its gait jerky and wrong, as if it was struggling against invisible chains. It reached out an impossibly long hand, fingers tipped with icicle-like claws. Ellie stumbled backward, tripping over the fallen locket. The moment her fingers touched the locket, the world seemed to tilt. The cabin vanished, replaced by a swirling void of frost and shadow. She was falling, or maybe floating. It was impossible to tell in this otherworldly abyss. The figure was still there, closer now, its featureless face inches from hers. "Why?" she managed to whisper, though she didn't know why she asked. Its voice came like the howling wind, cutting and cold. "You were warned." Ellie felt her body grow numb, the cold seeping into her very core. Memories flashed before her eyes, fragments of her life slipping away like melting snowflakes. She realized with a sinking dread that the stories were true. The winter haunt didn't just claim souls, it consumed them, leaving nothing behind but an empty husk. With a jolt, Ellie was back in the forest, lying in the snow. The cabin was gone, as were the footprints that had led her there. But the locket was still in her hand, its surface now tarnished and cracked. She staggered to her feet, the world spinning around her. She made it back to town just as dawn broke, her limbs heavy and her mind clouded with a strange fog. Her parents were frantic, demanding to know where she'd been, but she couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. Days turned into weeks, and Ellie withdrew into herself, her once vibrant personality fading like a photograph left in the sun. One day, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Ellie's mother found the locket on her daughter's nightstand. She opened it out of curiosity and gasped. The picture inside was different now. Instead of the eerie woman, there was Ellie, her eyes black as coal and her lips curled into that same faint, mocking smile. Ellie was never seen again after that night. But the townsfolk noticed something odd in the woods the following winter. A new set of footprints appeared, leading away from the forest's edge and disappearing into the snow. They were large, too large to be human, and they shimmered faintly as though frost clung to them in unnatural patterns. The legend of the winter haunt grew that year, whispered even more fervently in the cold, dark nights. And somewhere deep in the woods, a pale figure waited for its next visitor. The storm struck without warning, a blizzard so fierce it swallowed the horizon and turned the remote mountain road into a labyrinth of snow and ice. Claire, a traveling nurse, gripped the wheel of her old Subaru as the wind howled around her. The GPS had failed miles back, leaving her with nothing but instinct and a creeping sense of dread. When her headlights caught the faint outline of a sign, she almost missed it. Pine Haven Lodge, it read in peeling letters, an arrow pointing toward a narrow, tree-lined path. Claire didn't think twice. The road was impassable, and her car was nearly out of gas. A lodge meant shelter, and she needed it before the freezing night claimed her. The lodge appeared suddenly, a hulking silhouette against the storm. It was larger than she'd expected, its dark wood exterior half buried in snow. She parked her car and climbed the creaking steps to the front door, her breath clouding the icy air. When she knocked, the door swung open on its own, revealing a grand but eerily quiet lobby. A fire crackled weakly in a massive stone hearth, and the faint scent of pine lingered in the air. "Hello?" Claire called, her voice echoing. No response came. A thick guest book rested on the counter, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The last entry was dated over a decade ago. As Claire signed her name, the hairs on her neck prickled. She turned and found nothing but the empty room behind her. Shaking off the sensation, she grabbed a key hanging from the wall and ascended the staircase. The lodge creaked with every step, its timbers groaning like a sleeping giant. Her room was simple but warm. A heavy quilt covered the bed, and an oil lamp flickered softly on the nightstand. Grateful to be out of the storm, Claire sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. The storm wailed outside, rattling the windows and drowning out any other sound. It wasn't until she lay down that she noticed it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the wall behind her head. Claire froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It was probably just the pipes, she told herself, or the building settling under the weight of the snow. But as the minutes ticked by, the tapping grew louder. She bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. The sound had shifted, now coming from the ceiling directly above her. Grabbing the oil lamp, she stepped cautiously into the hallway. The lodge was impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides. "Is someone there?" she called. Her voice sounded small and fragile against the vast emptiness. A floorboard creaked behind her. Claire spun around, but the hallway was empty. The tapping resumed, this time from the end of the corridor. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Claire moved toward the sound. Her footsteps echoed, the flickering light of the lamp casting elongated shadows that danced along the walls. The tapping led her to a door. Unlike the others, this one was covered in scratches, as though someone or something had clawed at it desperately. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. When she opened it, she found a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Cold air wafted up from below, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of blood. Claire's grip on the lamp tightened as she descended. Each step felt heavier than the last, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive. At the bottom, she found herself in a stone-walled basement. The air was frigid, her breath visible in the dim light. A single table stood in the center of the room, and on it lay an array of objects: a rusted axe, a cracked mirror, and an old photograph. The photograph stopped her in her tracks. It showed a group of people standing in front of the lodge, their faces blurred as if the camera had shaken during the exposure. But in the center of the group was a face she recognized, her own. Her hands trembled as she picked up the photo, her pulse pounding in her ears. It didn't make sense. This lodge was nowhere near her usual route. She'd never been here before. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Slow, deliberate, coming down the staircase she had just descended. Claire turned toward the sound, holding the lamp up as though it could protect her. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice quivering. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt. Its face was a pale, twisted mockery of a human visage, the skin stretched tight over hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to grin impossibly wide. It carried an air of profound wrongness, as though its very existence defied nature. Claire stumbled backward, knocking over the table. The photograph fell to the ground, and she caught a glimpse of it just before it landed. Her image in the photo had changed. Her face was no longer blurred, but was instead pale and lifeless, her eyes black pits staring back at her. The figure moved closer, its footsteps echoing louder now. Claire's back hit the wall, and she realized with dawning horror that there was no escape. The figure reached out, skeletal fingers curling around the edge of the lamp, the flame extinguished with a hiss, plunging the room into total darkness. Claire screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The storm cleared by morning, revealing the lodge standing silent and still under a brilliant blue sky. A pair of hikers passing by noticed the car parked out front, its windshield covered in frost. They ventured inside, curious, but found no sign of anyone. The guest book lay open on the counter. The hikers noted the last entry and exchanged uneasy glances. The name scrawled there was Claire Dawson, followed by the date, 20 years earlier to the day. Above them, faint tapping echoed through the empty lodge, a sound that would grow louder with each passing winter. The isolated lake house was supposed to be a retreat, a quiet place for Karen to finish her manuscript before the publisher's deadline. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise of city life, it was perfect, or so it had seemed in the online listing. She arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the dense forest, casting long shadows over the frozen lake. The house was old, but well-maintained, with large windows that overlooked the icy expanse. The air was biting cold as Karen stepped inside, her breath visible even indoors. She cranked up the old radiator heater, unpacked her things, and set up her laptop on a rustic wooden desk facing the lake. The stillness of the place was unnerving, but she chalked it up to being alone for the first time in months. That night, Karen woke to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind, but it grew louder as she became fully awake. She glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. The whispers seemed to come from outside. Wrapping herself in a blanket, she crept to the window. The frozen lake shimmered under the moonlight, its surface smooth and unmarred. But in the distance, something moved. At first, Karen thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but the shape was wrong. It was too tall, too human. The figure stood at the edge of the lake, facing her cabin. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen, watching as the figure began to walk onto the ice. Its movements were deliberate but unnatural, as though its joints bent in the wrong directions. When it reached the center of the lake, it stopped. For a moment, it simply stood there, staring at the cabin. Then it slowly raised a hand and pointed directly at her. Karen stumbled back, pulling the curtains shut. Her heart pounded in her chest. "It's just someone messing around," she muttered to herself, though her voice trembled. But who would be out here in the middle of the night, in the dead of winter? She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she ventured outside to investigate. The lake looked as still and pristine as before, with no footprints or cracks in the ice. It was as though the figure from the night before had never existed. Shaking off the encounter, Karen decided to focus on her work. She spent the day writing, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to immerse herself in her story. That evening, as the sun set, she noticed something odd in the reflection of the glass door leading to the deck. A faint smudge, almost like a handprint, marred the otherwise spotless surface. Karen frowned, wiping at it with a dish towel, but the smudge didn't budge. It wasn't on the inside. Steeling herself, she opened the door and stepped onto the deck. The air was frigid, biting at her skin, but she forced herself to examine the glass from the outside. The handprint was unmistakable. Its long, thin fingers too large to be human. The sight sent a chill racing down her spine. Karen locked the door and drew all the curtains, determined to ignore the growing unease. She turned on every light in the house and poured herself a glass of wine. "It's nothing," she whispered. "Just some prank." But as the clock crept toward midnight, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. Karen clutched her blanket, her body rigid with fear. The whispers didn't come from outside this time. They came from within the house. Her pulse raced as she strained to listen. Words began to take shape in the murmurs, faint and fragmented but unmistakable. "You let us in." Karen grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen displayed no service, even though she'd had full bars earlier. A sudden thud came from the living room, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Her hands shook as she crept toward the source of the noise. The living room window was smashed, shards of glass glittering on the floor like diamonds. Snow blew in through the jagged opening, but there were no footprints outside. She turned to grab her coat and froze. In the hallway, the figure stood, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally toward the ceiling. Its face, or lack thereof, was a pale, smooth surface, featureless except for two deep hollows where eyes should have been. Those hollows locked onto her, radiating an unbearable cold. Karen bolted for the front door, yanking it open and sprinting into the snow. The forest was a maze of skeletal trees, their branches clawing at her as she ran. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that filled her head. "You belong to us." She didn't know how long she ran, the freezing air burning her lungs, her legs threatening to give out. When she finally stopped, she was at the edge of the frozen lake. The cabin was nowhere in sight. Karen collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The lake's surface was eerily smooth, reflecting the full moon like a mirror. But then the ice began to crack. It started beneath her feet, spider-webbing outward with a deafening sound. She scrambled backward, but the cracking followed her, and from the center of the lake the figure emerged. It rose slowly, impossibly, from beneath the ice. Water dripped from its form, freezing into icicles that clung to its spindly frame. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness as it extended one impossibly long arm toward her. Karen screamed as the ice gave way beneath her. Freezing water swallowed her, dragging her into the abyss. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the figure, standing over the hole in the ice, watching as she disappeared. Weeks later, the property manager arrived at the lake house to check on the overdue guest. Karen's car was still parked out front, and the cabin was locked from the inside. He found her laptop on the desk, her manuscript open to a single line repeated over and over. "They are here. They are here. They are here." When authorities arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of Karen. The only clue was the frozen lake, where a perfectly round hole had formed in the center, its edges scorched black as if burned by fire. The snowstorm descended with a vengeance, stranding Elijah and his friends in the middle of nowhere. They had been on their way to a weekend ski trip, but the blizzard forced them to pull off onto an unmarked road, the narrow path winding deeper into the forest. Their SUV finally gave up the fight, wheels spinning uselessly in the mounting snow. With no cell service and the temperature plummeting, they needed shelter fast. That's when they saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. They trudged toward it, their breath clouding in the icy air. The source of the light was a mansion, its looming silhouette like something out of a Gothic novel. Its windows glowed faintly, and smoke curled lazily from a chimney. Despite its imposing size, the house was eerily quiet. Elijah knocked on the heavy wooden door, and to their surprise, it creaked open. Inside, the air was warm, a welcome contrast to the bitter cold. The entry hall was grand, with a sweeping staircase and a chandelier that sparkled dimly in the firelight. The group called out, their voices echoing in the vast space, but no one answered. "This place is abandoned," said Julie, pulling off her gloves. "But at least it's warm." Elijah frowned. "No, someone's here. That fire didn't start itself." The group explored cautiously, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs. The mansion was lavish, but unsettling. The wallpaper was faded and the furniture was cloaked in dust, yet everything felt untouched. They gathered in the living room where a fire crackled in the hearth. Food sat on the dining table nearby, bread, cheese, and wine, looking fresh as though it had been set out moments ago. Against their better judgment, hunger won out. They ate quickly, rationalizing that the owner wouldn't mind if they took refuge for one night. As they settled in, strange things began to happen. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed at irregular intervals, though its hands never moved. Whispers drifted through the air, faint and unintelligible, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Elijah felt the first pangs of unease when he noticed the portraits lining the walls. Each depicted a member of what seemed to be a wealthy family. But their faces were wrong, smudged and blurred as though the painter hadn't finished them. In one painting, a woman's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. Julie screamed from the hallway, jolting everyone to their feet. They found her standing near the staircase, trembling. "I saw someone," she stammered. "A man. He was standing right there." She pointed to the landing, but it was empty. They tried to calm her down, insisting it must have been her imagination, but the tension was palpable. They decided to stick together for the rest of the night, gathering blankets and sleeping bags from their luggage. They huddled in the living room, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to grow louder. At some point, Elijah dozed off. He awoke to silence, the kind that pressed heavily on his ears. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in near darkness. His friends were gone. "Julie?" he called softly. "Sam?" No response. The house was deathly still. "Frères?" Elijah grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the hallway. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the long corridor stretching ahead. He heard a faint creak behind him and spun around, but the living room was empty. "Guys, this isn't funny," he said, his voice trembling. The whispers returned, louder now, filling his ears like static. They weren't unintelligible anymore. They were calling his name. "Elijah." He backed away, panic rising. The beam of his flashlight caught movement at the end of the hallway, a figure standing still. It was a man, his face obscured by shadows. "Who's there?" Elijah demanded, but the figure didn't move. As the light flickered, the figure began to dissolve, the edges of its form fraying like smoke caught in the wind. It wasn't gone for long. The whispers surged again, and when Elijah turned, the figure was inches from him. Its face was no longer hidden, but it wasn't a face at all. Its features were blank. A smooth expanse of pale flesh stretched over a humanoid shape. Elijah screamed, stumbling backward. He ran down the hall, his heart pounding. Every turn seemed to lead him in circles. Doors he tried were locked, and the ones that opened led back to the same room. The living room, its fire inexplicably roaring again. The portraits on the walls had changed. The blurred faces were now sharp and clear, and Elijah recognized them with a jolt of horror. It was his friends, Julie, Sam, Mia. Their painted expressions were frozen in terror, their eyes wide and mouths agape. He turned back toward the door, but the figure was there, blocking his path. Behind it, more figures began to emerge, their featureless forms shifting and twisting as they advanced. "Elijah?" The whispers hissed in voices that no longer sounded human. The last thing Elijah saw was the chandelier above him. Its flickering light dimmed as the figures closed in, and the world dissolved into blackness. Weeks later, a search party discovered the group's abandoned SUV on the snowy road. The mansion, however, was nowhere to be found. Locals claimed there had never been a house in those woods, but hunters sometimes reported hearing whispers when they ventured too far. And deep in the forest, where no one dared linger, there was a clearing where the snow never fell. At its center lay a single portrait, its canvas cracked and faded. It depicted 4 figures, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal fear. The small town of Black Hollow had always been surrounded by dense, snow-covered woods. They called the forest Silent Pines, not just for the eerie stillness that hung over it, but for the stories of people who wandered in and never came back. The townsfolk kept their distance, especially in winter when the trees seemed to close in, muffling all sound. Emma didn't believe in ghost stories. She was new to the town, having moved there to escape the suffocating hustle of city life. The quiet appealed to her, as did the cheap rent. She'd rented a small cabin on the edge of Silent Pines, figuring the isolation would help her focus on her freelance writing. The snowstorm came without warning, wrapping the town in an impenetrable white veil. By nightfall, Emma was completely snowed in. She tried to enjoy the novelty of it, lighting a fire and making tea, but the loneliness began to press on her. Her cell service was spotty at best, and the landline wasn't working. She stared out the window, her reflection merging with the dark trees beyond. Snow fell in thick sheets, and the woods were unnaturally still. And then she saw it. At first, Emma thought it was just the way the shadows played on the snow, but the shape was unmistakable. A figure stood at the tree line, barely visible in the falling snow. She squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, its outline blurred by the storm. She turned away, her heart racing. It was probably just a neighbor, she told herself, though she hadn't seen anyone nearby in weeks. Still, the thought of someone standing out there, staring at her cabin, made her uneasy. When she glanced back a few minutes later, the figure was gone. That night, sleep eluded her. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the windows and making the old walls groan. At some point, she must have drifted off because she woke to the sound of faint knocking. Tap, tap, tap. She sat up, every muscle tensed. The sound came again, louder this time. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the front door. Emma's breath caught her throat. She grabbed the fireplace poker and crept to the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the door and pulled it open a crack. The cold hit her like a slap, but the porch was empty. The snow was pristine, undisturbed by any footprints. Then she saw them. Not on the porch, but at the edge of the woods. 3 figures now, standing perfectly still among the trees. Emma slammed the door and locked it, her heart pounding. She backed away, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she peeked out the window, the figures were still there, watching. The power went out an hour later, plunging the cabin into darkness. The fire had died down to embers, leaving the room bathed in faint, flickering orange light. Emma lit a candle and huddled on the couch, her ears straining for any sound beyond the wind. The knocking returned, louder and more insistent. Bang! 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 This time it came from the back door. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Bang! 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 The sound echoed through the cabin, as if mocking her. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but they grew louder, their tone urgent and pleading. Emma? Emma! Let us in! She clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around her. Emma, we're so cold. Let us in. The walls began to creak, the floorboards groaning under the weight of unseen footsteps. Shadows moved across the room, cast by no discernible source. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, rocking back and forth as the voices grew deafening. Suddenly, everything went silent. The storm, the whispers, the creaking, it all stopped. Emma opened her eyes to find the cabin bathed in an unnatural stillness. The candle had burned out, leaving her in near total darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking. When she turned it on, the beam revealed something scrawled across the walls in dark, dripping letters. You should not have looked. The air grew impossibly cold, her breath misting in front of her. The flashlight flickered, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own. Then she heard it. A voice, low and guttural, speaking directly into her ear. Now we see you. The flashlight went out. Emma screamed. Days later, when the snowstorm finally cleared, a search party arrived at the cabin. They found it empty, the front door ajar. Inside, the furniture was overturned, the walls scratched with deep gouges that seemed to spell out words no one could decipher. The strangest thing was the footprints. They found dozens of them, bare, human footprints, leading from the woods to the cabin and then stopping abruptly at the front door. There were no tracks leading away. Of Emma, there was no trace. The only clue was her phone, found lying on the floor, its screen frozen on a single photo taken through the cabin window. It showed the snow-covered woods, the shadowy figures now much closer, their eyeless faces pressed against the glass. The wind howled like a living thing as Natalie trudged through the snow, the headlights of her sedan cutting dimly through the blizzard. She'd been driving for hours, the desolate mountain roads stretching endlessly ahead. When her GPS lost signal, she realized she was hopelessly lost. Her car began to sputter, the fuel gauge dipping dangerously low. She cursed under her breath. She hadn't seen another car or a sign of civilization for miles. Just as panic began to set in, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a cabin tucked into the woods. Relief washed over her as she pulled into the narrow drive and parked. The cabin looked old but sturdy, its single light glowing warmly through frosted windows. Smoke drifted from the chimney, a promise of warmth against the freezing night. Natalie grabbed her bag and hurried toward the door, her boots crunching on the snow. She knocked, the sound dull against the thick wood. "Hello? Is anyone home?" The door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" she called again, stepping cautiously inside. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and something faintly metallic. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a single armchair by the fireplace, a table with one chair, and a bed tucked in the corner. A fire crackled in the hearth, but no one was in sight. Natalie hesitated. It felt wrong to stay, but the storm outside was unforgiving and her car wouldn't make it through the night. She called out once more, louder this time, but the only response was the wind's mournful wail. "I'll just stay until morning," she muttered, shutting the door behind her. As the night wore on, the storm intensified, snow piling against the windows. Natalie wrapped herself in a blanket she found on the bed and sat by the fire, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping over her. The cabin was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt intentional, as though it were listening. She tried to distract herself, examining the few objects in the room. A dusty mirror hung on the wall above the fireplace, its glass warped with age. A bookshelf held only 3 books, their spines cracked and titles faded. But it was the photos that unsettled her most. Black and white portraits lined the mantel, each depicting a single person, unsmiling, their eyes too sharp, too knowing. One was of a young woman in a plain dress, her hair pulled tight into a bun. Another showed a man in overalls, his face partially obscured by shadow. They all seemed to stare at her, no matter where she moved. As the hours dragged on, Natalie dozed off in the chair. She woke to a sharp cracking sound, her heart racing. The fire had burned low, the shadows in the room deepening. She strained her ears, the sound coming again, like footsteps, but impossibly slow, deliberate. Her eyes darted to the door, which remained locked. The sound wasn't outside. It was coming from above her. Looking up, Natalie froze. The ceiling was made of old wooden beams, but something moved between the cracks. A shadow, slight but undeniable, shifted overhead. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The movement stopped. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, a loud thump came from the far corner of the room, near the bed. Natalie jumped, clutching the blanket around her. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The shadows near the bed seemed darker now, as though they were pooling, thickening. She could just make out a shape. A figure crouched low, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes reflected the dying firelight, gleaming like wet stones. Natalie bolted for the door, her shaking hands fumbling with the lock. It wouldn't budge. Behind her, the figure rose slowly, its movements jerky, as though it were unused to the act of standing. She grabbed the fire poker and turned to face it, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure had stepped into the dim light now, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. Its features were a swirling void, a blackness that seemed to pull at her very thoughts. The thing extended a hand, long, clawed fingers reaching for her. Its head tilted further, almost perpendicular to its body, as if studying her. "Leave me alone," she screamed, swinging the poker wildly. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it began to speak, its voice a low, guttural whisper that scraped against her mind like nails on glass. "You should not have stayed." Natalie backed into the door, her hands scrambling for the knob. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, drowning out her thoughts. She screamed again, pressing her hands to her ears, but the thing was already upon her. When the storm cleared the next morning, a local ranger noticed the abandoned car on the side of the road. The cabin wasn't far, but when he reached it, it was empty. The fire was out, the room coated in a thin layer of frost. The photos on the mantel were different now. Among the unsmiling faces was a new one, a portrait of a young woman with wide, terrified eyes, her expression frozen in silent horror. No one ever stayed at the cabin after that. But some nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees, travelers swear they see a faint light in the woods and hear whispers calling their names. The town of Gray Hollow was buried in snow, its streets nearly deserted as the harsh winter kept everyone indoors. Eliza had reluctantly returned to her childhood home to sort through her late grandmother's belongings. The house was old and creaked like it had its own voice, but it held fond memories, at least during the day. At night, the house seemed different, as if it were watching her. Her grandmother had always warned her about the attic. "Never go up there at night," she'd said. As a child, Eliza had listened, but as an adult, the warning felt absurd. The attic was just another part of the house, a forgotten space full of dusty trunks and old furniture. Still, when she heard faint noises coming from above on her first night back, her childhood fear stirred. She ignored it, convincing herself it was the wind. The next morning, she climbed the rickety stairs to the attic, armed with a flashlight. The wooden door stuck in its frame, but with a hard shove, it opened. Dust motes swirled in the beam of her flashlight. The room was exactly as she remembered it. Old trunks stacked neatly, an antique mirror leaning against the wall, and a single rocking chair sitting in the center. It was the rocking chair that caught her attention. It moved. Not a lot, just the faintest creak of the wood shifting forward, then back, as though someone had just gotten up. Eliza froze, her heart pounding. She stepped closer and stopped the chair with her hand. "It's just the wind," she muttered. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight caught something on the mirror's surface. A handprint. It was faint, pressed into the dust, as though someone had run their fingers across it recently. Her skin prickled. "Probably mine," she said aloud, though she hadn't touched the mirror. She left the attic, shutting the door firmly behind her. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder, creaks and thumps like footsteps moving back and forth. Eliza lay in bed, clutching the blankets tightly around her, her grandmother's warning echoing in her mind. At midnight, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a new sound, the soft, rhythmic creak of the rocking chair. Her blood ran cold. The next morning, she decided to leave. The house could wait. Her grandmother's belongings could wait. But as she packed her things, she noticed something on the kitchen table, a piece of paper folded neatly. It hadn't been there before. She opened it, her hands trembling. "Don't go. She doesn't like it when people leave." The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged and uneven. Eliza felt the walls of the house close in on her. She ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The locks twisted and turned, refusing to budge, though she hadn't touched them. Her phone had no signal. She screamed for help, but the sound seemed to vanish into the walls. The noises started again that night. They were louder than ever, heavy footsteps pacing outside her bedroom door. She pushed a dresser in front of it, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and then silence. The kind of silence that felt alive, as if it were listening. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room where an old mirror hung. It was dusty, the glass cracked in one corner. She could barely see her reflection in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, but as she stared, the reflection shifted. It wasn't her. A figure stood behind her, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face pale and gaunt, eyes black pits. The woman raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, her lips moving soundlessly. Eliza turned to look, but no one was there. When she looked back at the mirror, the woman's face was inches from the surface, her mouth stretching wide in a scream that made no sound. The mirror shattered. The next morning, neighbors found the house empty, the front door wide open, despite the fresh snow piled against it. Eliza's car was still parked outside, but there was no trace of her. The only clue was a single handprint in the attic mirror and a rocking chair that continued to creak, even when no wind stirred. Gray Hollow whispered of her disappearance for years to come, and those who dared pass the house swore they saw someone watching from the attic window, her eyes dark and empty as the snow fell around her. The road to Windridge Asylum was treacherous in the winter. Snow blanketed the narrow path, the surrounding woods stretching endlessly into the night. Evelyn's tires crunched through the icy terrain as she drove cautiously, her headlights barely piercing the swirling flakes. She regretted taking the job, but the money was too good to pass up. A single overnight shift as a security guard in the abandoned asylum. The building loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the dark sky. Windridge had been shuttered decades ago, its patients transferred to other facilities after reports of mistreatment and unexplained deaths. Locals avoided it, calling it cursed, but Evelyn dismissed the rumors. It was just a crumbling old building, she told herself. She parked near the front entrance, her breath fogging in the frigid air as she stepped out of her car. Her flashlight illuminated the faded sign above the door. Windridge Sanitarium. The metal creaked ominously in the wind. Inside, the asylum was deathly cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew. Her footsteps echoed down the empty halls, the beam of her flashlight dancing across peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The security company had left her a checklist. Make rounds every hour, check the doors, and document anything unusual. She wasn't sure what they meant by unusual, but the atmosphere alone set her on edge. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Evelyn patrolled the main hallways, the occasional drip of water from a cracked ceiling the only sound. The place was a maze of locked rooms, staircases that led nowhere, and eerie murals painted by former patients. Some depicted peaceful scenes, gardens, animals, but others were darker, twisted figures and screaming faces smeared in frantic, chaotic strokes. At midnight, she sat in the old security office, sipping from a thermos of coffee. She stared at the bank of dusty monitors, most of which were dead. Only one camera seemed operational, its black and white feed showing the lobby. That's when she saw it. A figure moved across the screen, a tall, gaunt man wearing what looked like a hospital gown. His head was bowed, his movements unnaturally jerky as he shuffled toward the main staircase. Evelyn froze, her coffee spilling onto the desk. No one was supposed to be here. She grabbed her flashlight and hurried to the lobby, her boots slipping on the icy tiles. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The lobby was empty, the staircase deserted. She swept the area with her light, but there was no sign of the man. She returned to the security office, her hands shaking. The monitor was now static. She tried to convince herself it was a glitch, maybe an old recording somehow playing back. At 1 a.m., the sound started. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the halls. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder with each passing minute. Evelyn followed it, her flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive dark. The tapping led her to the East Wing, a section of the building that had been sealed off long ago. The double doors were chained shut, but the sound was coming from behind them, sharp and insistent like someone knocking. She pressed her ear to the cold metal and heard something else. Whispering. Faint and indecipherable, but unmistakable. She stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers stopped, replaced by laughter, high-pitched and echoing. It sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, retreating to the safety of the security office. She locked the door and tried to calm her racing thoughts. The monitors flickered to life. Every screen now showed the same image. A single corridor in the asylum, its walls lined with open doors. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, a woman this time, her hair wild and her head cocked unnaturally to one side. She took a step closer, then another, her face obscured by shadows. Evelyn stared in horror as the woman on the screen began to run, her movements erratic and too fast, as though the footage were being sped up. She disappeared from the frame and the screens went dark. The lights in the office flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Evelyn grabbed her flashlight, but it refused to turn on. Her phone was dead too, the battery inexplicably drained. Panic set in as she fumbled for the door, her fingers numb with fear. She could feel it before she saw it, a presence in the room with her. The air grew heavier, colder, as though something unseen were drawing closer. And then she heard it. A voice, soft and raspy, speaking right behind her ear. "Why did you come back?" She spun around, but the room was empty. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the hallway beyond. The tapping returned, louder now, echoing off the walls. It was coming from the end of the corridor, where the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Evelyn backed away, her breaths coming in short gasps. The tapping turned into pounding, the sound reverberating through the building. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get out. The halls twisted and turned, every doorway yawning open like a gaping mouth. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with whispers and faint cries. Finally, she reached the front doors, but they wouldn't open. She yanked at them, screaming, but the locks held fast. Behind her, the pounding grew louder, and accompanied by guttural growls that sounded inhuman. She turned, her back to the door. The shadows were alive now, writhing and shifting, taking on terrible shapes. Faces emerged, twisted, hollow-eyed faces that stared at her with hatred. The last thing Evelyn saw was the figure from the monitor, the tall man in the hospital gown, his face stretched into an unnatural grin. He raised a bony hand, and the world went black. Days later, a maintenance crew arrived to check on the building. They found Evelyn's car abandoned outside, her belongings still in the front seat. Inside, the asylum was silent, the security office untouched. But in the east wing, the chains on the double doors were broken. Beyond them, in the dust of the long-forgotten corridor, were fresh footprints leading into the darkness. Evelyn was never found, and the townsfolk say that on winter nights, if you pass by the asylum, you can hear the tapping, always tapping as though someone or something is trying to get out. The snowstorm raged on as Alan steered his truck down the winding mountain road. He'd driven this route dozens of times, but the blizzard made every turn treacherous, the road barely visible under the thick blanket of snow. He was delivering supplies to the isolated outpost of Pinevale, a ghost town in winter but still home to a few hardy residents. It was supposed to be a routine trip. It wasn't. Halfway through the journey, his headlights caught something on the side of the road, a figure standing motionless in the snow. Alan squinted, slowing his truck. It was a woman, dressed in a thin, tattered dress, her hair hanging in dark, wet strands over her face. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling over. He rolled down his window, the icy wind biting at his face. "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't move, didn't even look up. Her bare feet were half buried in the snow, and her shoulders trembled slightly, as if she were cold but unwilling to step closer. Alan hesitated. Something about her felt off. "Miss, you need help? It's dangerous out here." Still no response. Against his better judgment, he stepped out of the truck, the wind whipping around him. The snow stung his skin, and his boots crunched loudly as he approached her. "Look, I can take you somewhere warm. Are you hurt?" As he drew closer, he saw her hands, thin and pale, her fingers twisted into unnatural angles. His stomach churned. She raised her head slowly, her movements jerky, as though each motion cost her great effort. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, too dark, and her mouth stretched into a slack, unnatural grin. Frost clung to her cheeks and lips, and her skin had a waxy pallor that made Alan's blood run cold. He stumbled back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but she moved faster. Before he could react, she lunged forward, her feet not so much stepping as gliding across the snow. Her fingers clawed at his jacket, and she let out a sound, an unearthly, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate in his skull. Alan shoved her off and sprinted back to his truck, his boots slipping on the icy road. He threw himself into the cab, locking the doors and fumbling for the ignition. The truck roared to life, and he floored it, the tires skidding before finding traction. In his rearview mirror, she stood in the road, her head tilted at an impossible angle, watching him as he sped away. Her grin never wavered. Alan didn't stop until he reached Pinevale, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. He parked outside the town's lone general store, his heart still pounding. The store's owner, Hank, was an older man who'd lived in Pinevale his entire life. He greeted Alan with a concerned frown. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Hank said, pouring him a steaming cup of coffee. Alan told him about the woman on the road. Hank listened in silence, his expression darkening with every word. When Alan finished, Hank shook his head. "You shouldn't have stopped," Hank said quietly. "That stretch of road's known for strange things." "What are you talking about?" Alan asked, his voice rising. "She was real. She grabbed me." "Oh, I'm sure she was real," Hank said grimly. "But not in the way you think. You ever hear of the Winter Woman?" Alan shook his head. Hank leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Back in the late 1800s, there was a girl who lived up here with her family. They were trappers, cut off from the rest of the world when a blizzard hit. The storm lasted weeks, and by the time anyone reached their cabin, they found nothing but bones. The family had turned on each other to survive. The girl was the last one left." Alan swallowed hard. "You're saying she... what? Froze to death?" Hank nodded. "They found her body on the road like she'd been trying to walk to town. But folks say her spirit stayed behind. She wanders that road, looking for someone to join her." Alan laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear curling in his gut. "That's just a story." Hank didn't smile. "You tell yourself that if it helps you sleep." Alan left the store an hour later, still shaken but determined to get back on the road. The storm had eased slightly, and he was desperate to put distance between himself and Pinevale. As he drove, the snow fell softer, the trees lining the road like skeletal sentinels. But then he saw them, footprints in the snow. Bare footprints, leading straight down the center of the road. Alan's pulse quickened. He told himself it was a coincidence, maybe someone from Pinevale wandering out too far. But as he followed the trail, his headlights illuminated a figure ahead. It was her. She stood in the middle of the road, her head cocked to the side, her grin wider now, impossibly wide. Alan slammed on the brakes, but the truck slid, careening off the road and into a snowbank. The engine sputtered and died. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled for his phone. No signal. A soft tapping drew his attention to the window. She was there, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes staring directly into his. Her grin was gone, replaced by an expression of pure animalistic hunger. Alan screamed as the glass began to crack under the pressure of her hand. Frost spread from her touch, the cold seeping into the cab. He kicked the door open and stumbled into the snow, running blindly into the woods. The last thing he heard was her voice, soft and echoing, carried on the wind. "Stay with me. It's so cold." Alan's truck was found days later, abandoned and half buried in snow. His footprints led into the woods, but they stopped abruptly, as if he'd simply vanished. Some say he's still out there, wandering with her. And on quiet, snowy nights, travelers swear they see two figures standing in the road, waiting for the next unlucky soul to join them.